Imagine a painfully familiar, almost intimate everyday situation. It's a quiet evening, you accidentally bump the table with your hand, and your favorite ceramic mug, perhaps brought back from a memorable vacation, shatters into pieces on the hard floor. Or, even worse, you snap off a tiny plastic latch from an expensive household appliance. What do? You go to the cabinet, take out a tiny metal tube smeared with dried white streaks, struggle to unscrew the cap that is dried shut, and squeeze a transparent drop onto the break. You carefully press the pieces together, but your hand treacherously twitches, and there it is. Literally a couple of microscopic drops get on your fingers. 3 seconds later, you realize with mounting horror that your thumb and index finger are glued together dead tight, as if they were welded with industrial arc welding. You panic, run to the bathroom, furiously rub your hands with a harsh pumice stone, try to soak them in boiling water, scrape them with a knife, but this cursed glue holds as if it is no longer chemistry, but the fundamental laws of physics. And now, let's sharply, without warning, change the scenery. Let's travel back in time and space half a century ago. It is 1968, the impenetrable jungles of Vietnam. Suffocating, 100% humidity that makes it impossible to breathe, the pungent smell of napalm, burnt aviation kerosene, and gunpowder. From the sky, through the dense tree canopies, breaking branches and raising a hurricane of dirt and leaves, a Bell UH-1 medical evacuation helicopter, the legendary Huey, descends with a deafening roar of its blades. On board, on the blood-soaked metal floor, lies a young American soldier. His chest has been torn open by mine shrapnel or a bullet, hitting a major artery and damaging his liver. Blood is gushing with such intensity that it's a matter of seconds, not even minutes. Traditional surgical threads, scalpels, and clamps are absolutely, catastrophically useless here. The military medic physically won't have time to apply stitches in a helicopter shaking from vibrations while the 19-year-old guy rapidly bleeds out. And then the medic, tossing aside all sterile instruments, pulls a small canister from his pouch that looks like a regular household aerosol and begins generously, non-stop, pouring straight into the open, pulsating wound, right onto the living internal organs. Exactly the very same liquid that you were just using to glue your broken mug in the kitchen. Today we are going to dissect the history of cyanoacrylate. You know it by the trademarks Superglue, Superglue, Crazy Glue, or simply Secunda. And believe me, this is not just a boring tale about a chemical curiosity or a useful invention. It is an epic corporate and medical thriller. It is a story about how a material, intended to become the perfect optical site for destroying people, was ruthlessly rejected by the corporate machine solely because of its stickiness. About how the mistake of a sweating lab technician, which destroyed an incredibly expensive optical device, spawned a global consumer market valued at billions of dollars today. About how harsh, pragmatic military medicine violated all conceivable rules of civilian bureaucracy to save thousands of lives on the battlefield, and about why something that heals under bullets can kill in a sterile hospital ward. To understand the very origins of this chemical drama, we need to go back to 1942. The United States of America had just entered World War II after the catastrophic, humiliating strike by the Japanese fleet on Pearl Harbor. The American government, finally realizing that they were about to wage a total war on two giant fronts, in ruined Europe and across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, began flooding the defense industry with unimaginable billions of dollars. The war of engines, aviation, and heavy artillery required not only steel, aluminum, and gunpowder. It required perfect, absolute optical precision. The B-17 Flying Fortress strategic bombers vitally needed the famous Norden bomb sights, highly complex analog computers with a system of lenses that allowed dropping bombs from insane heights with surgical precision. Snipers on the front lines needed flawless optical sights. Artillerymen and battleship captains needed stereoscopic rangefinders. Millions of lenses were required for all these deadly devices. Traditionally, for centuries, lenses were made from classic optical glass. But glass, despite all its merits, is an incredibly temperamental, heavy, and fragile material. It shatters easily from the vibrations of a tank engine and from the impact of even minor shrapnel. And most importantly, the manufacturing process of optical glass was agonizingly, unbearably long. It had to be cast in furnaces, slowly cooled for days to relieve internal stress, and then polished by hand for weeks. This was done by highly skilled master opticians who were in disastrously short supply under mobilization conditions. The military machine couldn't wait for a gray-haired master to spend a month polishing a single lens for one bomber. Then the U.S. military department set a super task before the chemical corporations. We urgently need a plastic as transparent as a baby's tear. We need a material that can simply be poured into a metal mold, left for a couple of minutes until it sets, and then pulled out as a finished, perfect optical lens that wouldn't require any grinding or polishing at all. This would speed up the production of sights thousands of times over, allowing them to be stamped out like buttons for soldiers' greatcoats. The Eastman Kodak Corporation took on this incredibly juicy, unlimited government contract. Yes, the very same legendary Kodak company that you probably remember for its yellow film boxes, point-and-shoot cameras, and Polaroids. It is important to understand that in those years, Kodak was not just a manufacturer of consumer cameras. It was a gigantic, powerful chemical conglomerate that, seeing how rapidly the civilian entertainment market was shrinking due to the war, desperately wanted to bite off a massive chunk of the military pie. Deep in the Kodak laboratories in Rochester, New York, worked a 32-year-old research chemist named Harry Coover. He was a meticulous, pedantic person, incredibly pragmatic, and focused solely on results. Coover and his team of lab technicians were tasked with thoroughly researching a specific class of organic compounds called cyanoacrylates. Theoretically, according to the chemist's calculations, these substances could polymerize, that is, solidify from a liquid state, into an absolutely transparent, hard monolith that would transmit light perfectly and be suitable for creating plastic optics. The harsh wartime laboratory routines began. Coover took a clear, liquid cyanoacrylate monomer, carefully poured it into a special, mirror-polished metal precision mold for casting a lens, and waited. The chemical reaction was successful. The liquid indeed turned into a hard, crystal-clear plastic. The optics seemed perfect. Coover, satisfied with the result, grabbed the mold's handles to pull it apart and extract the finished lens, and realized with surprise that it wouldn't open. He pulled harder. The mold wouldn't budge a millimeter. He asked the lab techs for help. They took tools and tried to pry the edges with steel screwdrivers. Useless. The plastic hadn't just hardened inside the metal block. It had fused dead tight, on an atomic level, with its walls. The precision mold, which cost an insane amount of money, was hopelessly and irretrievably ruined. Coover, being a stubborn scientist, repeated the experiment over and over, trying to use various silicone and oil lubricants for the molds. The result remained unchanged and depressing. This cursed liquid stuck to absolutely everything it touched. To metal, to glass, to rubber, to plastic, to tables, to lab coats, and to the hands of the lab technicians themselves. In the wartime corporate world, logic is simple, linear, and cruel. You have a contract to create a transparent lens. Your experimental material breaks expensive molds, ruins laboratory equipment, and makes the mass casting process physically impossible because the part simply cannot be extracted from the machine. What conclusion does an efficient corporate management draw? That's right. This material is useless, defective garbage. Harry Coover, grinding his teeth in frustration over the lost time, wrote in his final report to the management and the Pentagon that cyanoacrylates are too sticky, unmanageable, and categorically unsuitable for use in military optical systems. The formula was sent to a dusty archive. The project was officially closed, funding was cut, and Coover switched to other, more promising tasks for the front. No miracle occurred. The future superglue was rejected, humiliated, and consigned to oblivion simply because it glued too well, devilishly well, when all that was required of it was to be a transparent piece of hard plastic in an optical sight. A long 9 years pass. World War II ends with nuclear mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world changes forever. The era of the Cold War, nuclear parity, and jet aviation arrives. The year is 1951. Harry Coover, having climbed the career ladder, is now working as a research group leader at the giant Tennessee Eastman Chemical Plant, a division of the same Kodak Corporation, but now in Tennessee. Military aviation, meanwhile, faced a new, terrifying engineering problem. Fighter jets switched from piston engines to jet propulsion and started flying at such insane speeds, breaking the sound barrier, that friction against the oncoming airflow heated the canopies, transparent domes, of the cockpits to extreme temperatures. Traditional aviation polymers and plexiglass, from which these domes were made, couldn't withstand it. They began to melt, cloud over, deform, and lose transparency right during the flight, blinding the pilots. Military engineers once again came to the chemical corporations with suitcases of money. We urgently need new, heat-resistant, transparent polymers. Coover, remembering his old wartime developments that had been shelved away, decided to dig into the archives again and pulled out the rejected cyanoacrylates. His logic was simple. Perhaps, if we slightly alter the chemical chain and play around with the molecules, we might still manage to make a refractory, heat-resistant dome for the new fighter jet out of these sticky resins. He assigned his new subordinate, a young and inexperienced engineer named Fred Joyner, a routine task: to re-examine the optical properties of various variations of cyanoacrylates. In particular, Joyner needed to measure the refractive index of light of a liquid called ethyl cyanoacrylate. An Abbey refractometer was used for this absolutely standard, daily laboratory procedure. It was an incredibly precise, complex optical device assembled by hand in Europe and obscenely expensive for those times. It cost about $3,000. Adjusting for inflation, in modern money, this is equivalent to the cost of a good new premium car, over $35,000. The principle of operation of the Abbey refractometer is conceptually simple but requires perfect cleanliness. One must place a tiny drop of the liquid being tested between two heavy glass prisms, perfectly polished to a molecular shine, carefully clamp them with a metal lever, shine a beam of light, and look through the eyepiece at the refraction scale. Joyner, suspecting nothing, took a glass pipette, dropped a drop of transparent ethyl cyanoacrylate onto the lower prism, smoothly lowered the upper one, and clamped the mechanism. He looked into the eyepiece, took the readings, and pedantically wrote the numbers down in the lab journal. The job was done. Now he just needed to wipe the device with a solvent to prepare it for the next experiment. Joyner grabbed the metal lever to lift the upper prism. It didn't move. He applied a little more force. The prism stood rock solid, as if bolted down. Joyner frowned, braced his feet against the heavy lab table, and pulled the lever with both hands, risking breaking the delicate mechanics of the device's hinges. To no avail. The two perfectly polished glass prisms had stuck together dead tight, turning into a single glass monolith. Joyner fell into a state of animalistic, paralyzing panic. He realized that just now, out of his own stupidity, he had destroyed a device worth several $1,000s with his own hands. In the harsh corporate realities of 1951, for such a monstrous blunder and the destruction of company property, one could instantly be fired and blacklisted, forever closing their path in science. Pale, sweating, with trembling hands, Joyner slowly walked down the long corridor to the office of his stern boss, Harry Coover, and, stuttering and swallowing his words, reported that he had just broken the main laboratory refractometer. Coover, growing visibly darker, stood up from his desk, went to the laboratory, looked at the prisms glued firmly together, tried to pull them himself, and then silently clutched his head. And right here, in this quiet laboratory in Tennessee, we need to make a crucial conceptual pause. Because at this very moment, looking at the ruined, irreparably destroyed device, Harry Coover didn't start shouting. He didn't fire the young lab technician. Instead of anger, he experienced that blinding, piercing epiphany that separates an ordinary, dutiful clerk from a historical figure. Coover suddenly realized an incredible thing that overturned all the canons of chemistry. In those years, all strong industrial adhesives known to mankind, such as epoxy resins, polyurethanes, or casein glues, required complex, tedious manipulations. They had to be mixed from 2 or more components in strict proportions, otherwise they didn't work. They had to be heated in ovens, or they had to be compressed under a hydraulic press for long hours until the toxic solvent evaporated. But this transparent liquid in the refractometer required absolutely nothing. Joyner didn't add any hardener to it. He didn't heat the glass prisms with a blowtorch. He didn't wait a day. The substance glued 2 heavy pieces of glass dead tight in a couple of seconds at ordinary room temperature, without any pressure. How on earth did that happen? Simply put, the chemistry of cyanoacrylate works like a domino effect locked in a tight cage, or like an incredibly tightly compressed spring. A cyanoacrylate molecule is a monomer. It is an aggressive loner molecule that desperately, on a chemical level, wants to connect with other molecules just like it to form a long, unbreakable, strong chain, a polymer. But while they are inside the tube, or in Joyner's flask, they float separately. Why? Because at the factory, a microscopic amount of a stabilizer, a weak acid, is added to this liquid. This acid works as a chemical brake, like a straitjacket for the aggressive molecules, preventing them from linking with each other. What is the trigger for this spring? Ordinary water, or more accurately, hydroxyl ions, which are abundant in water. This reaction in chemistry is called anionic polymerization. As soon as the cyanoacrylate comes into contact with the slightest, microscopic amount of moisture, the acid brake is instantly neutralized. The straitjacket falls off. The molecules, freed, rush toward each other at frantic speeds, building a giant, incredibly strong crystalline polymer lattice, biting dead tight into all the microscopic irregularities, pores, and cracks of the surfaces being glued. And moisture, as you understand, is everywhere. There is no hiding from it in our world. On the perfectly polished glass prisms of the refractometer, there was the thinnest, invisible to the eye, layer of condensation from the surrounding air. There is always moisture on a broken porcelain mug. And, most importantly, on your fingers, even if they seem absolutely dry to you, there is always a microscopic layer of sweat, sebum, and moisture. This is exactly why superglue adores human skin so much and glues it 1,000 times faster and stronger than wood or plastic. For cyanoacrylate, your skin is a perfect, moist catalyst. Coover, standing in front of the broken device, realized the colossal scale of the discovery. They had been looking for a heat-resistant plastic for the canopies of jet fighters, but had accidentally found the holy grail in the world of adhesives. A glue that requires no heat, no pressure, no mixing, and no special skills. a glue that works instantly. But it is one thing to make a brilliant discovery in a lab, and entirely another to sell it to the corporate machine. Breaking through Kodak's impenetrable bureaucracy was incredibly difficult. The management of the chemical giant twirled their fingers at their temples and sincerely didn't understand why they, a reputable corporation, should sell some sticky glue in small tubes when they were dealing in multi-million-dollar industrial chemical supplies and dominating the photographic film market. It took a full 7 years of exhausting persuasion, presentations, field tests, and endless approvals from the board of directors. Here another titanic engineering problem arose, one that few people think about. How do you package a glue that instantly sticks to everything it's poured into? If you pour cyanoacrylate into a glass bottle or a standard metal tube, it will simply stick to the walls and harden there forever, even before it hits the store shelves. After all, there is air inside the container and there is moisture in the air. Kodak's engineers had to develop special, non-reactive tubes made of a specific dense polyethylene, and the process of packaging the glue on the conveyor had to take place in an atmosphere of completely dry nitrogen, devoid of even a hint of a water molecule. Finally, all the technical circles of hell were passed, and in 1958, a product under the dry, nomenclatural name Eastman 910 timidly entered the commercial market. And then, the company's marketers faced a colossal positioning problem. How do you sell people a glue that is so aggressive and dangerous in unskilled hands? A glue that cost an insane amount of money, almost $3 for a tiny vial weighing a few grams, which in the late 50s was quite a significant amount for a housewife's budget, and additionally glued fingers firmly to the table, causing panic among buyers. The marketers realized traditional magazine advertising wouldn't work. Visual shock content was needed. A demonstration bordering on magic was needed. In 1959, Harry Coover personally, wearing a sharp suit, appeared on the most popular American evening TV show of the time, I've Got a Secret. On live television, in front of tens of millions of viewers frozen before their screens, the show's host, Gary Moore, took 2 heavy steel cylinders attached to strong industrial cables. Coover, smiling, dropped exactly 1 single drop of Eastman 910 glue between these steel blocks. They pressed the cylinders together with their hands and waited exactly 10 seconds. Then the upper cable was hooked to a ceiling winch, and a special gymnastic trapeze was attached to the lower cylinder. Gary Moore, nervously chuckling, grabbed the trapeze with his hands. The winch motor began to hum, the cable pulled taut, and the host, dangling his legs, was lifted off the ground. 1 small transparent drop of glue, which had undergone only 10 seconds of pressing, absolutely calmly supported the weight of a large adult man hanging in the air. A dead silence hung in the studio, which then erupted in a standing ovation. America went crazy over what it had seen, and when, on another television broadcast, a heavy passenger car weighing 1.5 tons was hoisted into the air by a crane on a single drop of this same glue, sales of Eastman 910 broke through the ceiling and skyrocketed into the stratosphere. Soon, the license to produce cyanoacrylate was purchased by other large chemical corporations, including the famous Loctite. The glue acquired the aggressive commercial names we are accustomed to: Superglue, Crazy Glue. It permanently settled in every garage, in every kitchen drawer, in every workshop from New York to Tokyo. People use it to glue torn shoes, antique vases, torn off suitcase handles, broken children's toys, and car parts. Corporations make hundreds of millions of dollars off our everyday clumsiness. It would seem like a perfect, complete capitalist success story. Invented, patented, sold, became rich. But, as I said at the very beginning, the history of great innovations often writes its most important, most poignant chapters not with ink on bank checks, but with blood. And our story takes its darkest, yet most noble and incredible turn here. we transport ourselves to the 1960s, the Vietnam War. This war differed radically, fundamentally, from World War II or the Korean War. It was an exhausting war of ambushes, invisible traps, snipers, and thick, impenetrable jungles. But the main difference lay in military logistics and medicine. It was the first true helicopter war in history. While during World War II, a wounded soldier could bounce around in the back of an ambulance truck over broken roads to a field hospital for hours or even days, dying of sepsis and blood loss along the way, in Vietnam, medical evacuation helicopters, the famous dust-off units, delivered the wounded directly from the battlefield to a sterile surgical tent in 15 to 30 minutes. In military medicine, there is a concept called the golden hour, the time during which qualified care must be provided to save a life. In Vietnam, this hour was shortened. It would seem that such an incredible speed of evacuation should have radically reduced mortality. And statistically, this is indeed true. But a new monstrous dilemma arose before the medics, which was named the Platinum 10 Minutes. The helicopter managed to get the soldier there in 15 minutes, but a soldier with a severe shrapnel wound to the chest, abdomen, or neck, with a torn liver, a punctured lung, or a severed carotid artery, would bleed out and die in 3 to 5 minutes right on the floor of the flying helicopter. Frontline military medics, so-called corpsmen, were in a state of absolute daily despair and powerlessness. Applying a tourniquet to an arm or leg torn off by an explosion is easy. They teach that in boot camp. But how, pray tell, do you apply a tourniquet to a torn open chest? You don't. Trying to stitch up a bleeding artery with traditional surgical threads under a hail of enemy machine gun fire, standing knee-deep in a muddy swamp, or on board a helicopter shaking from wild vibrations, where the patient is tossed a meter in the air, is physically, technically impossible. Soldiers died not because their wounds were fundamentally incompatible with life. They died from simple blood loss before they could be placed on an operating table in front of a proper surgeon. The Army needed a miracle. It needed an agent that could instantly, as if by magic, plug a hole in a human body like plugging a breach in a ship. And then the military brass remembered Harry Coover and his phenomenal Eastman 910 glue. By that time, Coover, who had become a true fanatic of his invention and believed in its limitless possibilities, had already begun independently exploring its medical potential on animals. The scientist's logic was ironclad, based on Joyner's discovery. We know for sure that cyanoacrylate polymerizes instantly upon contact with water. What are human blood and all internal tissues made of? That's right, mostly of water. So, according to the laws of chemistry, the glue should bond living flesh dead tight in fractions of a second. Coover, having enlisted the support of the medical giant Johnson & Johnson and the Army Medical Corps, developed a special delivery format for cyanoacrylate, not in the form of a small tube, which is inconvenient to drip onto a wound, but in the form of a spray, a pressurized aerosol can. And right here, the classic, impenetrable American bureaucracy steps in. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the powerful FDA, categorically, under the threat of criminal prosecution, forbade the use of cyanoacrylate on humans. Why? Because this wonder glue, in its original form of ethyl or methyl cyanoacrylate, had its own dark, hidden flip side that chemists could not ignore. Firstly, when this glue hardens, a violent exothermic reaction occurs. It releases heat, heating up to the point of causing painful second-degree burns. But even worse, when this synthetic glue begins to slowly degrade over time inside the human body under the influence of natural fluids, it releases formaldehyde and cyanoacetate. These are incredibly toxic substances. They kill the living cells around them, causing tissue necrosis and a severe local inflammation. The FDA bureaucrats stated firmly, Are you out of your minds? You cannot pour a toxic industrial glue that causes thermal burns and flesh necrosis into people. In peacetime, in a bright, sterile hospital in Los Angeles or New York, this rule was absolutely logical, correct, and unshakable. No head physician wants to get a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for a chemical burn and necrosis in a patient who came to stitch up a finger accidentally cut in the kitchen. But the stuffy, blood-soaked jungles of Vietnam were not an elite hospital in Los Angeles. The military medics pulling chunks of metal out of their comrades couldn't have cared less about long-term carcinogens, formaldehyde emission, and possible tissue necrosis a month later. They needed only one thing: for a 19-year-old kid with a hole in his chest not to die from blood loss right now and to live until the evening. And the U.S. military, possessing its own harsh sovereignty in wartime, effectively ignored the prohibitions of the civilian FDA. In 1968, special field surgical teams and evacuation helicopter medics secretly received boxes containing canisters of cyanoacrylate spray. What happened next sounds like a fictional scene from a dark cyberpunk action movie, but it was the brutal, everyday reality of the Vietnam War. A soldier sustains a severe shrapnel wound. The helicopter lands right under fire. The medic drags the screaming wounded man on board. The helicopter soars into the sky. Blood from a damaged liver or torn thigh spouts like a fountain, flooding the stretcher. The medic doesn't pull out a sterile needle, thread, and clamps. He doesn't have time for that. He pulls out the aerosol can with industrial superglue and simply sprays it right into the gaping, bleeding wound, directly over the pulsating internal organs. Life-saving chemical magic occurs. Blood and tissue fluid instantly act as a catalyst. Cyanoacrylate sets in fractions of a second. It forms a tough, rigid, plastic, absolutely waterproof crust over the wound. The bleeding stops instantly, as if someone has shut off a valve. Yes, the exothermic reaction burns the tissues, causing additional pain. Yes, the formaldehyde begins to poison the surrounding cells. But the bleeding is stopped. Blood pressure stabilizes. The soldier is brought alive to the base field hospital. A real, experienced surgeon puts him on the operating table, takes a scalpel, cold-bloodedly cuts away this plastic superglue crust along with the top layer of chemically necrotized tissue, because necrosis is indeed beginning, reaches the clean, undamaged artery and, in a calm, controlled environment under good anesthesia, carefully stitches it up with normal medical silk threads. Cyanoacrylate did not treat the wound. It wasn't medicine at all. It simply put death on a tactical pause. It bought the severely wounded soldier those golden 30 minutes of life that he physically lacked to reach the operating table. According to various classified military statistical estimates, the unprecedented use of cyanoacrylate spray on the battlefields in Vietnam saved the lives of thousands of American soldiers who, in the conditions of any other previous war, would have guaranteed 100% bled to death on the spot. Harry Coover, watching the reports from military medics, would later say in an interview that this illegal medical application of his invention was the most important, proudest achievement of his life, immeasurably more important than all the cars lifted into the air and the millions earned by the corporation. Before we move to the finale of this medical saga, we must make one incredibly important digression. It turned out that superglue possesses another mystical property that forever changed forensics. And for the Secret Life of Things channel, this detective offshoot is simply essential. In 1978, in parallel with the glue conquering store shelves, forensic experts in Japan, and then in the UK, encountered a strange phenomenon. In laboratories where cyanoacrylate was used, investigators noticed that distinct, white fingerprints of the lab technicians themselves began to appear on the smooth surfaces around the workspace. Police chemists began to dig into this anomaly and were thrilled. The fact is that when a person touches glass, plastic, or a weapon, they leave an invisible trace of sweat, oils, and amino acids. Previously, police looked for these fingerprints by dusting them with graphite powder. But the powder worked poorly on uneven surfaces and rubbed off easily. What does cyanoacrylate do? If you pour a little superglue into a small cup and heat it in a closed chamber containing a gun or a knife from a crime scene, the glue begins to evaporate. Its vapors waft through the chamber, and as soon as these invisible vapors bump into the microscopic remnants of moisture and amino acids in the fingerprint, they instantly polymerize right on them. The vapor turns into solid white plastic, which perfectly, with microscopic precision, replicates the criminal's papillary ridge pattern. It becomes impossible to accidentally rub off or wash away this plastic fingerprint. It is soldered onto the weapon dead tight. This method was called cyanoacrylate fuming. It revolutionized forensics. Hundreds of cold cases, old unsolved crimes around the world, were solved because investigators retrieved old evidence from archives, placed them in chambers with superglue fumes, and found perfect fingerprints of killers that could not be found with regular powder. The glue, created to kill in war, not only saved lives, but also started catching criminals. But let's return to our medical drama. The Vietnam War ended. The veterans returned home. The field surgeons who had worked in the jungles and seen the magic of superglue with their own eyes returned to their civilian hospitals in the U.S. and began demanding that authorities allow its use on regular patients. But the FDA's bureaucratic wall stood dead firm. No, the toxicity of methyl cyanoacrylate is unacceptable in peacetime. Forbidden. And this is where the corporate chemical industry did what it does best when it smells truly billion-dollar global markets. It didn't argue with the bureaucrats. It started hacking the glue molecule itself. The chemist's logic was brilliant in its simplicity. If the original ethyl cyanoacrylate degrades inside the human body too quickly and releases too much toxic formaldehyde in a short period of time, poisoning the tissues, then what must be done? The formula must be changed so that the glue degrades in the human body so slowly that the immune system has time to quietly, invisibly, and painlessly eliminate this toxin naturally. The chemists realized they just needed to lengthen the molecule's carbon chain. Instead of a short ethyl radical, they attached a long, complex octyl radical to the molecule. A new substance was formed, octyl 2-cyanoacrylate. This new upgraded molecule was a true marvel of medical bioengineering. It glued living tissues just as instantly and reliably. But at the same time, it possessed fantastic new properties. Firstly, it was less brittle. The hardened glue could bend and stretch along with human skin without cracking. Secondly, it didn't heat up to the point of burning when setting. And most importantly, it degraded so slowly that formaldehyde was released in microscopic, completely harmless doses for the body. No necrosis. No poisoning. Only a perfect seam. The Johnson & Johnson Corporation invested huge, astronomical sums in multi-year clinical trials. The bureaucratic millstones ground agonizingly slowly. Just think about this figure. It took almost 3 decades after the end of the Vietnam War to finally prove the safety of the new glue to stubborn bureaucrats. Finally, in 1998, the FDA officially, publicly approved the use of medical cyanoacrylate under the commercial brand Dermabond for sealing wounds in civilian hospitals. Today, if you end up in a good, modern clinic with a deep cut on your face or arm, they will most likely not give you agonizing, painful stitches with threads that must be removed later and leave ugly railroad track scars. A surgeon will simply draw the edges of your wound together with tweezers and carefully run a special purple marker with medical superglue over them. The skin will bond instantly. The glue will create a strong, waterproof barrier protecting the wound from bacteria and infections, and in a couple of weeks, when the wound heals from the inside, this plastic layer will simply peel off by itself, like old skin, leaving a thin, barely noticeable aesthetic scar. And now let's sit back in our chairs, exhale, and look at this entire grandiose story from a bird's eye view. We see how the wheel of samsara has made a perfect, paradoxical, closed rotation, full of bitter and bright irony. In 1942, an ambitious chemist tried to create the perfect optical lens for bomb sights to make weapons of mass destruction more accurate and deadly. But his project failed miserably because the material hopelessly ruined the metal mold. 9 years later, this very same failed material nearly cost a young engineer his career and reputation because it glued the parts of an expensive optical device dead tight. What broke precision instruments and infuriated scientists was packaged in a metal tube and sold to us, ordinary people, so we could fix our broken, cheap toys, detached souls, and shattered dishes, periodically gluing our fingers together in panic. And then, this very same household annoying chemical, whose place was in a toolbox, went to the dirtiest, bloodiest jungles of Vietnam to violate all medical bans and flood open, fatal wounds, saving people from inevitable blood loss. The glue, born for bombers, became a life preserver, and then it became an indispensable tool for forensic experts, solving decades-old murders using invisible vapors. And finally, having passed through corporate laboratories, courts, decades of bureaucratic wars, and chemical hacks, this molecule returned to sterile, cold-lit operating rooms around the world to elegantly, without pain and blood, seal incisions after cesarean sections, saving mothers, and hide scars after highly complex plastic surgeries. Every time you angrily curse, scrubbing the dried, ingrained white crust of superglue off your fingers with a harsh pumice stone or acetone, just remember that at this very moment you are touching a substance that made an incredible journey from rejected military garbage to one of the most brilliant tools in field surgery and forensics. The things surrounding us in our daily routine have a habit of living their own secret lives, full of incredible irony hidden from our eyes. And superglue is perhaps the stickiest, most paradoxical, and indelible mark in the history of humanity's chemical accidents.